My name is Nikhil Jain, and I'm a third-year student here at HLS, majoring in International Law and Institutions and Central Eurasian Studies. Over the past 3 years, I've had the privilege of interning on Capitol Hill, studying abroad in the republics of Turkey and Azerbaijan, and serving my community at home in political campaigns and local elections. Through all of my experiences, I have learned that regardless of political alignment, national security is ever present in the minds of both policymakers and common citizens alike. This administration has created numerous national security policies, and it's increased armed and diplomatic conflicts and instability from climate change, refugee crises, and pandemics. Agreements and negotiations with China, North Korea, Palestine, and non-state actors such as the Taliban have been formed, broken down, or reformed in this past year alone. Rising tides of nationalism worldwide have turned global politics from once a seemingly dry and monotonous affair into something akin to a Netflix original series. As a student of international studies, I'm fascinated. As a global citizen, I'm fearful. And as the introductory speaker for the panel on national security challenges in the upcoming decade, I'm excited to introduce our panelists and moderator. Andrew Bell is an assistant professor at the Hamilton Lugar School. His current research examines the effect of international humanitarian law and norms of restraint on combatant conduct towards civilians during war. He has served as an active duty and reserve officer in the US Air Force, with service in Iraq and Afghanistan. Kelly Magsamen is the Vice President for National Security and International Policy at the Center for American Progress. She's the recipient of honors from the Secretary of Defense, Central Intelligence Agency, and Department of State. She is also a frequent national security commentator on CNN and MSNBC. Nicholas Rasmussen is the Acting Executive Director and Senior Director for National Security and Counterterrorism Programs at the McCain Institute for International Leadership. He has over 27 years in US government service, including in senior counterterrorism posts at the White House and the US intelligence community from 2001 to 2017. Frank Rose is a senior fellow for security and strategy in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. Prior to joining Brookings, Rose served as Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification, and Compliance, and as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Space and Defense Policy. He has also held positions at the US Department of Defense and in the US Congress. Our moderator, Lara Jakes, is a diplomatic correspondent at the New York Times. She has reported and edited for more than 40 countries over the last 20 years and covered war and sectarian fighting in Iraq, Afghanistan, Israel, the West Bank, and Northern Ireland. Please join me in welcoming our guests.
Thanks so much for that introduction. I'm super psyched that now I don't have to go through the bios of each of our wonderful panelists. So that'll give us more time for questions. I'm encouraging everybody to ask questions in the last 40 minutes of our session today. I want to give first a shout out to all the students who are here, especially those who are standing here and who are going to stand for the next 75 minutes. I hope their professors are here and take note and give all of these people A's. That's admirable. I'm really excited to be here today at this distinguished institution with this amazing group of national security experts as we talk about challenges that confront us in the next decade, now and over the next 10 years. My goal for this discussion is to be informative but also interesting without scaring the bejesus out of everybody. We talked a little bit about why we might be fearful in the decade to come, and there is a reason for that. When I hear the word challenge, I'm a reporter, so when I hear the word challenge, I think problem. And when I hear the word problem, I think threat. And that comes from being a war correspondent and always kind of being on my guard. And certainly we face an array of threats here in the United States and with the American outlook for the rest of the world. Some of these must be dealt with immediately. And unlike the last 10 years, and certainly unlike 20 years ago, most of the urgent threats that we face today are not things that go boom. They're maybe not terrorism in the way that they were in the aftermath of 9/11. Maybe there are other things that we need to deal with immediately that we haven't seen around the corners to identify. Like, for example, how many people here are wondering how many people are going to get sick or die before coronavirus can be stopped? I was at the CVS down the street last night while I was trying to pay for my face soap. The phone rang and the guy behind the counter was telling somebody, no, we don't have any more face masks. And I said, do you get a lot of those calls? And he said, yeah, about half of my night job is dealing with calls from people who are looking for face masks. Is anyone else here wondering if the United States, and I mean broadly, the government and financial institutions and the public itself, is prepared for a cyber hack that could knock out our electrical grid, that could steal from our bank accounts, or could disrupt further future elections? We all know that that's a concern and a problem, and could dramatically disrupt the way Americans live. How about the challenges facing our environment, as we heard from the last panel? Who here likes to drink water? The path from global warming to water shortages, to food shortages, to political instability, to very big problems indeed, whether it's war or refugees, is a path that's very well established. And then, yes, of course, there are the things that go boom. We need to be aware of them, prepared for them, and we'll talk about some of that as well today. For example, we just cut a tentative peace deal with the Taliban in Afghanistan, and as you know, these are the guys who helped Al-Qaeda with safe haven in the run-up to 9/11, and American troops are preparing to withdraw. Meanwhile, the Taliban has not stopped launching attacks. How's that going to end? As of this week, as I'm sure most of you know, Iran has declared that it now has enough enriched uranium to build a nuclear bomb. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that's probably not what President Trump had in mind when he enacted the maximum pressure campaign against Tehran. And at the same time, North Korea this week launched its first missile test of the year. Meanwhile, our NATO ally Turkey is on the verge of outright war in Syria. And our most steadfast allies, the ones in Europe, are increasingly shrugging off Washington's warning and pursuing a 5G network supplied by Huawei, the Chinese telecom giant. These are all of what I think of as challenges to diplomacy, maybe democracy, but challenges to diplomacy, and by extension, threats to national security. Are we pursuing the right deals? Are we defending so-called American values? Have we empowered our best and brightest diplomats and intelligence officials and military officers and enlisted men and women to even do so? These are some of the issues I think we'll get to today, at least I hope so. To keep things light in the effort to not scare the bejesus out of everybody, and given also that you'll be hearing from a lot of people over the next 2 days, I'm going to share a bit of trivia about each of our distinguished experts as I introduce them. That way, from here on out, whenever you think about matters of international law and urban warfare, you'll think of that guy who's sometimes mistaken for Mark Zuckerberg and sometimes mistaken for Prince Harry.
It's happened.
Yeah. I'm thinking more Prince Harry. Right? You're welcome.
Thanks.
But first, here's a little story of my own. Almost exactly 10 years ago when I was in Iraq, I went to a little town outside of Baghdad called Yusufia. It was a town of palm trees and muddy roads. There were blue skies that day. It was also a town that had kind of the last little, I don't know how to describe it, outcropping of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which, as you know, later became ISIS, or Daesh. And I was there to interview a sheikh who's the leader of the local militia that was called Sons of Iraq, or called the Saqwa, or called the Awakening. All the same group, different people had different names for it. And it took me a long time to, oh, by the way, if you're not aware, the Saqwa was this militia that had allied with American forces in Iraq against the insurgency, against Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and pretty much turned the tide of the Iraq war from when it was in the darkest days into a position where the American military could eventually withdraw its combat units. And so I was there. It took me a lot longer to get there than I had anticipated, and the interview went on way longer than I had anticipated. There was a lot of back and forth between the translators, and you just have to kind of take your time with some of these interviews. But at the end of it, I was getting ready to go, and the sheikh said, "Please, Lara, we've prepared lunch for you. I hope you'll stay." And I said, "Oh, sheikh, I'm so honored. Thanks so much, but I really need to get back to Baghdad, and I need to start writing my story." And he said, "Oh, no, please stay. We want you to stay." "Oh, thank you, sheikh. No, I'd really love to stay, but honestly, I need to get back to my office and start writing my story." And this went on for about a minute. And finally, the security guard who was with me said, "Lara, please stay, okay?" And so I'm thinking maybe what some of you all are thinking, okay, there's a security event down the road. Maybe they're trying to protect me. Maybe he knows something that I don't. But actually, I was wrong. When I said, "Okay, sheikh, thank you, I'd be honored to stay," he clapped his hands, and the doors opened, and in came several women pushing tables that were piled with food. You know, it was probably all the food that that family had in their house for a week. And they probably spent days preparing it for me. So can you imagine if I'd just been like, oh, I don't need your hamburger, I'm going to walk out, and left them there, not only feeling like they had been embarrassed, but also having such a negative impact of Americans and the way we see the rest of the world, and not paying respect or heed to norms and cultures. And so I say that today, not just to point out how sometimes your moderator can be a little tone deaf, although that was certainly the case at the moment. But I like to think of it as a lesson in listening, of casting aside preconceived notions, of keeping an open mind about how to overcome a challenge or solve a problem and to keep it from becoming a threat. So with that, let's go right to the questions. And it looks like we have about 25 minutes before I open it up to the audience. And it gives you a little bit of time to come up with all of the penetrating issues that I didn't get to today. So, Nick, let's start with you. He laughs.
Okay.
You may recognize Nick's shoulder from the photo of the, do you remember the famous photo in 2011 in the sit room when Obama and the national security team was watching the raid on bin Laden's house in Abbottabad? If you don't remember, it's the one where Hillary is going like this. This is my best Hillary impression. Anyways, and so Nick's shoulder was in that photo. So
It's famous.
very, very close to power, that shoulder. I want to talk for a few minutes about COVID and cyber threats. Both show how vulnerable, the way that both of these threats have unfolded in the United States and indeed the rest of the world over the last not only years, but especially in the last month or two, shows this vulnerability that maybe came out of nowhere. So can you talk a little bit about why we weren't adequately prepared to confront this and how we keep it from sliding into chaos, based on your vantage point of how the National Security Council would have dealt with this?
And that's the only perspective I will be able to bring, because I'm not an epidemiologist or anything like that. Kelly and I served together as staffers at the National Security Council staff under both presidents, Presidents Bush and President Obama. And so I think we both have a pretty good sense of how the process should work, and what the American people should be able to expect, whatever the crisis, whatever the challenge that emerges is that the relevant experts, the relevant expertise, the relevant knowledge will be brought to the table and then processed through an orderly conversation that lays options on the table, that is done in a way that does not consider politics, in a way that is designed to bring forth courses of action that are all organized around the principle of how do we protect the American people or advance our interests. I would argue that for most of modern history, we've been able to count on that process being in place. Whether you were a Republican or a Democrat, whether you supported President Bush or supported President Obama, again, as Kelly and I both did, we served on the National Security Council of both presidents, that orderly process could be counted upon, in my mind, in most cases, in almost all cases, to surface the right set of options for consideration and decision. I worry now that that's not the case. And so I think we're seeing, and the coronavirus episode, I think, is that perhaps quintessential example of where we see the butting of heads of a political agenda and science. And so what I hope is happening, what I guess could have counted on as happening in every previous administration, I wonder if it is happening, or if the individuals are in fact around the table, are they there able to freely speak their mind? Are they able to offer up the kinds of options, whether they're more aggressive options, whether they're more passive options, that you would want experts to offer up?
Wait, can I stop you for a second?
Sure.
So how would that have worked under a President Obama or a President
Well, we don't have
Bush?
to guess. We know how it worked. The Ebola episode emerged in the second Obama administration and put many of the same demands. And I'm not going to compare scale and lethality or anything like that. Let the scientists do that. But what you did have was the President Obama early on putting Ron Klain, a very senior official who had broad ties across the government, into a position of leadership, leading an interagency task force that would bring together all of the relevant public health expertise. Because again, if you're in the White House Situation Room, you're not always expecting to sit around the table with the Secretary of Health and Human Services or the head of the Center for Disease Control. But when these public health matters become national security matters, as Ebola did, as coronavirus is, you want those people around the table, you want their expertise to guide the conversation.
But here's my question. How does the talk around the table actually translate into protecting people?
What it should do is result in clear communication strategies to the American people about what the risks are, what risks they face personally, what risks they face in their community, and most importantly, what practical steps they can take to protect themselves, or if they don't need to worry about it, what they need to do to go on with their daily lives. And again, I think we're seeing some of this with your little visit to CVS. Most government experts would tell you, don't waste your time buying masks. Let those masks flow to the public health professionals who are actually much more at risk than the average individual. But there are other steps that you as American citizens should take, and pay attention to wash your hands. And again, I thought it was extraordinary. Kelly and I spoke about this last night. President Obama the other day tweeted out his guidance to people about what he thought needed to be done, or and I think he was acting based on what he knew from the CDC and other public health experts. But he obviously felt like he was filling a gap, because he felt like the communication strategy emanating from the executive branch and the White House right now wasn't sufficient to the task. And just to broaden out a little bit from coronavirus, I see the same set of concerns more broadly when we're talking about other national security challenges, whatever they are, with the administration's reluctance to rely on intelligence professionals and national security experts when offering up decisions, when thinking about potential courses of action. You've seen the way in which the intelligence profession has been in some ways denigrated, delegitimized, and that, I think, is one of those attacks on our institutions that has long-term costs well beyond the particulars of Iran, nuclear deals, or particular policy issues.
Can I just add? I think pandemic disease is going to be a major issue for the next century. In addition to climate change, what I worry about the most is that these sort of very complex national security, global security challenges are coming at a time when public trust in institutions is at an all-time low, not just in the United States, but globally. And so that trust gap, I think, is having a real impact, which is why I think you see people running to try to get, hand sanitizer and masks, because they're not necessarily sure that what's being communicated to them from the U.S. government is actually clear guidance. Just as an example of how complex this is, it's not just coordinating across the federal government, Health and Human Services, National Security Council, it's coordinating with state and local governments as well, and having an actually really effective response all the way down to the local level. So OPM yesterday, the Office of Personnel Management, issued guidance about federal employees and travel to some of these countries of high risk. That's level 3 and level 2 countries. And they're going to quarantine all federal employees for 14 days who have traveled to these countries. Well, is that guidance for the American public too? Mm-hmm. So it's this it's really important for there to be transparency and clarity. There should be a regular daily public briefing from the experts, the CDC experts, not layered in but by Vice President Pence offering advice, or the president calling into Fox News and suggesting this is not a big deal, or focusing on the markets, which frankly isn't even relevant at this point. That's the kind of coordinated effort that needs to be undertaken, and that's what I think what we're not seeing right now.
Yeah, I'm reminded of right after 9/11 when President Bush said, if you don't do X, then the terrorists win, right? And so I wonder if that's what Trump is trying to do today with, no, don't worry about going to Disney World. I think Vice President Pence was asked the other day if he would go to take his family to Disney World for spring break right now, and he quickly diverted to another question. But worth noting. But Kelly, let's talk a little bit also about cyber threats. There are disinformation campaigns happening. There's hacking happening. You talked about this trust deficit with allies. And when we have the adversary at the front door, China, who's knocking on the door of all of our allies saying, we want to sell you this 5G network that you want. And frankly, the United States doesn't have a viable alternative for a 5G network, which we all want faster internet, right? It's becoming the way of the world. So when I talk to diplomats, to European diplomats, they say the United States has not given us proof of how this is going to compromise our systems, and yet we still want to be good partners. We still need the intelligence that the United States is saying that it will withhold from us if we take the 5G network. Is this something, first off, is there really a threat to national security if our allies, you can be honest with us, will our allies truly be compromised if they take 5G networks. Certainly, Prime Minister Johnson doesn't feel like this is a risk worth, that he's particularly worried about in terms of taking the Huawei network. And secondly, is allowing Huawei potentially into our systems a greater risk than alienating those allies?
That's a good question. I mean, my personal view is the way the administration has approached this issue of Huawei, especially with respect to our European allies, has been extremely counterproductive. Very much, having Secretary Pompeo travel to Europe and sort of try to say, well, just trust us and browbeat our allies into just agreeing with our guidance is not necessarily going to achieve the effect you want. We saw that outcome in the UK decision. Germany's about to make a similar decision. I suspect they'll follow the UK model, which is essentially trying to carve out specific areas where Huawei will not be able to invest in public infrastructure. I worked on China for quite some time in the US government. I can't speak to current intelligence, whatnot, but I will say I do view Huawei as a challenge and a significant issue for the United States and its democratic allies. China does have intentions of shaping global governance. We see it constantly in institutions, whether it's the World Health Organization, whether it's Interpol, and other international institutions, where they are actually trying to shape global governance more towards an authoritarian lens or more accepting of an authoritarian model. I think Huawei is a security risk for the United States and its allies. The question, though, is, to your point, we're not offering a viable alternative, which is a real problem. I happen to think there is one out there. I think it would require the United States and some of its democratic allies to work closely with each other. The Japanese, for example, have been pushing on this to have some sort of joint offer to Europeans of different technology and networks from the United States, Japan, and Australia. So there are options, but it requires us to actually work collectively with our democratic allies to put them forward. And it requires the investments at home and our own competitiveness to ensure that in the future, we're able to offer.
Why hasn't that happened?
I think people, U.S.-China competition is a buzzword in Washington right now. Every think tank has a conference about the future of U.S.-China competition, mine included. And people see it as a foreign policy issue. I happen to see it as a domestic policy issue. I believe that we need to be making the investments in our research and development here at home. Our research and development investment has been going down, not up. The Chinese is going up. We need to be making investments in higher education. For example, graduate education guarantees for STEM education, potentially scholarships in that direction, because the Chinese are catching up with us on the number of PhDs that they produce in these fields. So it's really, the way we're going to compete with China is not just going to be in the South China Sea. It's going to be in places like Indiana and Michigan and Ohio, investing in the American people, which is frankly the source of our global strength.
Frank.
Can I just add, I agree with everything that was just said, but let me also say, I do believe we are in a competition with Russia and China for the future of the international order. And one of our asymmetric advantages in that competition is our system of alliances. It's something that the Russians and the Chinese and other authoritarian states do not have, and something that they've been trying to undermine. So that's number one. But secondly, on the point of new technologies, not just cyber, but I would say all information technologies, outer space, undersea communications cables, the Russians and Chinese and other potential adversaries have been watching very closely over the last 25 years. As we've been dealing with situations in Iraq and Afghanistan, Russia and China have been developing a unique set of military capabilities, offensive cyber capabilities, anti-satellite weapons, and other types of systems designed to undermine America's strategic advantage in information technologies. And I think we're going to have to spend some significant time over the next couple of years filling in and enhancing the resiliency of our ability to operate in this new environment. That includes, as Kelly said, improving our internal ability to innovate and create people and produce people like you do here at Indiana U that understand STEM issues. That is going to be critical because China is not just copying the United States, they're beginning to innovate. And secondly, and just as important, we need to work closer with our allies.
Andrew.
If I could just add on that too, I think those are great points. And actually, before I start the comments too, I wanted to give a shout out for all the this mass of students that are here as well. Everywhere I go, I tell people Hamilton Lugar is an amazing place because the students are genuinely interested in global and international affairs, and this is a real recognition of that. So it's fantastic to see you all here. And also for the staff for putting this on. But as to the point, I wanted to note that I think one of the main blind spots that the U.S. government and the U.S. military in particular is currently facing in regards to information technology and ability to dominate the infosphere is protection of our personnel, protection of our force. And so probably the biggest indicator of this was the OPM hack of a few years back, in which it's now been recognized that a foreign actor, the Chinese, were able to gain detailed intelligence information on a vast number of U.S. government and military personnel. We tend to be not...
As well as their personal information.
As well as their
personal... That happened in my household.
Yes, yes, exactly. So we tend to be a little bit, I think, a step or two behind in understanding that dominating the infosphere is not just using technology and new systems, but also protecting the force, protecting the people who are actually going to be implementing these in any kind of conflict or crisis in the future. We always seem to be lagging in terms of understanding the imagination of what our adversaries are able to do. And this is a danger that's only increasing with recent news about location data being tracked by private companies. If it's being tracked by private companies, which is pretty much prevalent across our society, you can be well assured that this is also being tracked by foreign adversaries as well, who are able to access those systems. And then with the increase in AI technology and being able to analyze this data, put together information across literally millions of Americans to try to synthesize and understand who might be vulnerable for intelligence collection, who might have other vulnerabilities, people who are at the highest levels of government all the way down to the lowest levels of the government or even the military. I think we're quite open to some pressure and some dangers there, and that's certainly an area where we need to concentrate greater protection in addition to developing new systems as well. So.
Well, that's a happy note.
Yeah. Sorry to kill the wall.
So staying on happy themes, Frank.
Yep.
Frank, by the way, was knighted in Romania. He is Knight Frank.
Yep. That
Sir Frank.
Sorry.
that in 25 cents won't even get you a cup of coffee.
But it'll get you a mention from the New York Times. So.
But as Secretary Kerry said at my swearing-in ceremony at the State Department, he was a knight before he was honorable. So.
Yeah. Okay, I wanted to wish you a happy non-proliferation nuclear weapons anniversary day, by the way, big 50. So I know you all have been waiting on the edge of your seat for this day, but for big guns people, it's a big deal. So let's talk about Iran and North Korea.
Yeah.
They're both showing weapons right now. They're both kind of putting their fist in the Americans' face. The Iran nuclear deal, the shorthand, the JCPOA, has been blamed for Iran's race to enrichment over the last couple of years. But we also see in North Korea that diplomacy didn't work. The kind of the kumbaya that President Trump was going for has fallen flat, if not completely keeled over at this point. So really, how do we try to contain both if neither the force or threat nor kumbaya works?
Yeah. Laura, that's a great question, and both are very different situations. Let me start with Iran and the Iran nuclear deal, also known as the JCPOA. Now, I think the critics were right on some of these criticisms. For example, it did not deal with the ballistic missile threat from Iran. It did not deal with their their terrorist activities in the region. All true. But the fundamental point about the Iran nuclear deal was this. It was working. And the State Department, under the Trump administration, in their annual arms control compliance reports, which I was responsible for developing when I was Assistant Secretary, said Iran is in full compliance with their obligations. So I think the Trump administration made a major mistake getting out of the agreement. One, and this is really important, it made it much more difficult to address the other issues like Iran's ballistic missiles and their terrorist activities in the region. I am very concerned that our allies now look at us and they say, can we really count on you to do another agreement? Now, my hope is in the future we will get back to the table. But I think one of the questions that partners will have is, will the United States stand by that agreement? Obviously, maximum pressure is not working. I don't know how we get back to the table in this administration. My personal opinion, it will probably require a new president. And I think that's probably the Iranian calculation at this point.
Don't you think if President Trump is reelected and Iran's economy goes south, that Ayatollah Khamenei is going to have to come back to the table?
We'll see. It has not worked to date, but it's a possibility. But, you know, when you look at this administration's track record, and I have not been totally, I would say, critical with them on arms control. For example, I think they made the right decision getting out of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Agreement with Russia for a variety of reasons. We can talk about that in the Q&A session. But their strategy is not working. The way you solve problems like this is not unilaterally. The way you solve problems with countries like Iran is through pressure with your allies.
Okay, so seg from that into North Korea. Why is diplomacy not working in North Korea?
Well, fundamentally, at the end of the day, the North Koreans see nuclear weapons as a guarantee of their security for the regime. And I don't believe that the current regime is ever going to give up its nuclear capabilities. So fundamentally, what we have to do is a mix of things. We need to deter them by developing effective conventional and nuclear capabilities. We need to defend against the potential threat with homeland missile defense and short-range missile defense in the region. And then we have to have a role for diplomacy to try to mitigate that risk. But fundamentally, Laura, I do not believe the North Koreans will give up their nuclear program because the regime believes it's fundamental to their security.
Yes or no, was it a mistake for President Trump to try to open a diplomatic channel, unilateral diplomatic channel with Kim Jong-un?
No.
Great. So there's that. Thank you. Prince
Very
Harry.
undiplomatic.
Prince Harry.
Mark, please.
I'd like to talk a little bit about Syria, what's happening there. It's not an issue that I think is getting widespread attention right now in the United States with the array of things that are going boom out there and other scary things that affect Americans more directly. But there are about 1 million refugees who are sitting on the Turkish border. I think there's about 300,000 refugees who are trying to get into Greece right now. President Erdogan has just opened the Turkish borders to Europe saying, all right, refugees, come pass through and then move out to the next place. Don't be my problem. But the United States, notably, is not playing. It's trying to do a diplomatic effort to enforce a UN resolution that has been introduced years ago with almost no effect, no practical effect. Does the United States have an obligation to be more involved to protect people in Idlib, which is kind of the epicenter of this new brewing, very catastrophic war? I mean, if you think about it, Syria's been in civil war for a decade now, and this seems to be about as worse as it's ever been.
Yep, that's a great question. It's a tragic situation, of course. I think one of the unfortunate. Democracies, of course, have great strengths, and they're quite resilient and have a lot of benefits. One of the downsides of democracies and democratic decision-making is that your average citizen and potentially even your average policymaker runs into what can be called casualty fatigue after a while, or losing the attention, the short-term attention span that we all seem to face. And so Idlib and Syria has dropped off the front page of the news until just recently, when people sort of remembered, I think, that there is still a war going on. Same issue as U.S. forces in Afghanistan. It's a tragic humanitarian situation. It's one that the U.S. I think has relegated some of its influence because having being not able to find solutions earlier in the conflict. I think there was almost a sense of, well, we're just going to throw our hands up and let things play out as we have. And now, as you mentioned, there are about 1 million refugees, people who have moved not just once from their house, but 3, 4, 5, 6 times, facing attacks from various parts of Syria as the government has continued its campaign. And it's a tragic situation. The Syrian government has moved from earlier in the war, when it focused primarily on targeting opposition forces, to now about 90% of its attacks are focused on civilians and civilian areas. So to give you some insight into the nature of the government that we're up against. Unfortunately, it's a situation where there are no easy solutions. I'm sure that the panelists who have served on the National Security Council can attest to the discussions that have happened on the inside about what do we do about Syria. But unfortunately, what tends to happen is that there's less of a focus on what can we do. And I think the recent Turkish incursion into northern Syria, in which the Turks were able to mobilize a fairly I don't want to say rudimentary, but certainly not the highest, most technologically advanced military in the world, but utilize their systems that they have, drone systems and whatnot, to really take down the Syrian military, to stop the Syrian military's offensive in some ways, to push it back. Shows that there are options that the U.S., I think, could have engaged with and then gave up earlier in the conflict. So to answer your question, there is an obligation that's still there. It's something that we can't just forget. It has implications not only for the people on the ground, but also for our allies in Europe, for the nature of global stability and the effect on politics that these influxes of refugees have. And so my fear is that the current administration finds it convenient to not make this a priority, and we'll continue to see this type of suffering play out until the conflict is finished.
Well, certainly this administration has made it clear it doesn't want to get sucked into endless wars, right? And I think that's actually an interesting point, because that is something that the Obama administration was very worried about as well. I mean, it's true that the Obama administration withdrew troops from Iraq, set the stage for withdrawing troops from Afghanistan, also because they felt like the world needed to, America couldn't be the world's policeman, right? So how is it that the United States is supposed to do anything that makes any kind of difference when we know that the UN resolution has not?
Right. Well, so one of the points of criticism that I have of the Obama administration is that for all the negative talk that the Trump administration has received over its foreign policy over the years, it actually was willing to take a risk on short-term interventions earlier in the conflict. And so we saw very short-term missile strikes in 2017, 2018. And the results of that actually, and this hasn't played out in the news quite as much, but if you go back and look at the conflict data, actually had a significant effect in limiting to some extent what the Syrian government was doing to its people. And so the fact that the Obama administration earlier on decided to back away from options such as no-fly zones, or perhaps very limited interventions of some sort, or signaling its greater interest in using force of some kind, the Trump administration was able to accomplish and not get sucked into these conflicts. So there are, of course, the Security Council is the primary route that we want to resolve these issues. But at the end of the day, the U.S. still has the role of leadership, as the primary leader in the world, and we have an obligation, I think, to use that ability to try to resolve the situation.
Yeah, I think what makes Syria so challenging is that it started off really in the Arab Spring context, right? Of course, with the protests against Assad. Then it metastasized into a counterterrorism challenge for the United States and the region, and a humanitarian challenge. And now it's become a geopolitical challenge. And so the fact that you have so many different layers to this conflict, geopolitical all the way down to humanitarian issues, makes international response very difficult. And Nick and I can talk about this a lot. I think for a very long time, the Obama administration's strategy around Syria was very much driven around counterterrorism concerns early on in the conflict. And I think that had an outcome we didn't anticipate at the time, the Russian intervention, for example. And so now you're seeing Russia kind of fill a vacuum in the absence of American leadership. He has, Putin has invited Erdogan to Moscow today, actually, to have conversations and talks about the future of Syria. So, in Putin's mind, this is great. He's weakening a American and European front. He's trying to draw a NATO ally into the Russian sphere of influence. And I just don't think we have a very coherent strategy to deal with the geopolitical pieces of this, not just the counterterrorism or the humanitarian dimension. So it's one of the worst issues I ever worked on in government. It was always very challenging and heartbreaking on many levels. But I think the fact that the United States currently isn't leading at all or doing any kind of regional and international diplomacy around the issue, or even attempting to do it, is going to have real follow-on effects for probably decades in the region.
Nick?
So since I don't have a fix for Syria for all of the reasons that Andrew and Kelly just said, I'm trying to think of it now more these days in terms of lessons learned, because I think we are where we are with Syria. We've, in a sense, forfeited a fair amount of leverage, and we are now operating in an environment where all of the choices are bad. But what I do want to do, though, and this is where a place like IU and students who are actually in school today can help, is we need to rethink our models. We spent most of the post-9/11 era thinking about our biggest national security challenges being terrorism and counterterrorism. And our toolkit for managing that set of problems involved large US force presence overseas, so-called forever wars. I hate that term, but I'm going to use it just for the purposes of this conversation. And what we haven't figured out is how to back our way out of that model into a more manageable model, manageable from a resource perspective, manageable from a domestic political support perspective. What are the American people willing to do and put up with in terms of putting their young men and women in harm's way overseas? And yet we still have a set of global responsibilities that we have to respond to. And these conflict zones around the world, Lara, that you've reported from, things happen there that end up creating security problems here inside the United States. So it isn't really an option for us simply to say, bring everybody home and hope it all works out okay on the other side of the ocean. We know that that's a strategy that won't work. So I don't have an answer, but I do know we have to come up with a model that gives us a lighter footprint with more agility overseas. Kelly will remember we spent some time in the aftermath of the Benghazi tragedy in Libya a number of years ago trying to rethink how we protect our people overseas. Do we have to only do this in ways that involve large numbers of forces permanently stationed in places where we're not welcome or where it's very expensive, where it comes with political cost? There's a call for some real fresh thinking. And I would argue that whether it's a Democratic president or a second Trump administration, they would do well after the current election phase to maybe have an honest conversation with the American people about how we do this. Because there is going to be an enduring mission for us to deal with instability overseas, but doing it the way we've done it for the last 20 years is not sustainable politically, economically, or I would even argue morally.
But is the American people prepared to have that honest conversation? That's the political kind of calculus.
That's why I said have the conversation after November.
Yeah.
Because I don't think either of our candidates, whoever they turn out to be, could have that conversation in a way that makes it sound like they are forfeiting America's leadership role, for example. And I'm not advocating that. I guess what I'm talking about is more of a reshuffling of the toolkit and how we use the toolkit. And some of this came up in the conversation on climate this morning. The kind of the soft power tools that the United States has and doesn't use around the world nearly to the effect that we need to could have powerful impact on these security challenges we're talking about. But they're longer term, these programs or these resources take longer to achieve the effects that we want. And so we're an impatient culture, an impatient political body here in the United States.
Actually, and sorry, speaking of impatient, I'm going to do a speed round and then I'm going to open it up to questions. So speed round, let's keep our answers kind of tight here so that students have an opportunity. Last month at the Munich Security Conference, Secretary Pompeo said that the West is winning. Is the West winning? Or is this a trust deficit that Kelly referenced a little earlier? Is this something that can ever be fully overcome with our allies? And I'm going to start with Kelly. I'm going to take a breath to give her a second and let you know that she is the custodian of rubber duckies from across the world. Her favorite is from New Zealand and represents the rugby team there. So let's take a breath, and Kelly, take it away.
Is the West winning? I think the answer is we don't know yet. I do believe that we are in an era where there's going to be a significant test of the democratic liberal model. And I think you're seeing that play out not just here in the United States, whether our system of government can function effectively and deliver results for the American people, but also with respect to our democratic allies in Europe and abroad. And I think there is an emerging model out there, the China model, that is attractive to a lot of folks. So I do think this is going to be, I think what's going to shape this century is basically a test of the two models of political and economic development. I happen to believe in the liberal democratic model, but we have a lot of work to do to improve the effectiveness of our governance here at home, frankly, and also with our friends overseas.
Thanks. Andrew.
The West is winning. It is winning. Maybe not apparent just yet, but it's been winning. It will continue to win. Now, it faces some significant challenges. People tend to think about Russia as sort of our preeminent adversary out there. The GDP of Russia is less than that of Texas. Russia is basically a scary monster that projects itself as a large one, but it's actually a tiny bear just with some nukes, which are important to think about. I think the China model is definitely the larger threat, the one that we should be more concerned about as far as the trajectory of our different models and the model for the liberal democratic system. But I think at the end of the day, it'll take some time. There's a lot of work to be done, particularly in our own domestic sphere. There's some house cleaning that has to happen with our own internal processes and institutions, but it'll come out stronger in the end.
Frank.
I think it's unclear. In the past, we have argued, given our culture of innovation, our fluid institutions that allowed good ideas to come to the top, the U.S. and our system of values would always put us ahead in the competition. I'm not so sure today. I mentioned earlier with regards to China and technology. In the past, the U.S. view was, well, the Chinese can steal our technology and reverse engineer our technology, but they can't innovate. What we're starting to see now in key areas like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and other areas, the Chinese and other authoritarian states, but primarily the Chinese, are innovating. So I am really concerned. Now, I don't think we have lost this competition. I think there are a number of steps we can take, strengthening our democratic institutions here and abroad, working to increase STEM education, and improving other things, but I'm not sure if we have the political consensus at this point within the United States and abroad with our allies to do that. And I think whomever is elected president in November of this year, boy, that came fast. I'm still in 2017. Is going to have to focus on these fundamental issues, because I don't think we have lost yet, but if we continue on this trajectory, weakening our internal institutions, weakening our alliances, I think we could lose.
Nick.
Viewed through the long arc of history, we're winning, but it's hard to, it doesn't feel that way necessarily at a moment when things, as you laid out at the front, Laura, seem so challenging across so many different fronts. But I think it's worth remembering the greatest source of our comparative advantage over other systems, competitive systems, is economic and political freedom. And we still have that, and that is still our greatest source of advantage. To Frank's point, though, and to some of what Kelly said, we risk undermining that with our own inability to solve our own problems, whether those problems are coming up with a functioning healthcare system, dealing with climate change, dealing with the growing threat of domestic terrorism here in the United States. We're not as worried about jihadists as we were 5 years ago, but we sure are worried about people who subscribe to radical extremist ideologies across a host of other parts of the ideological spectrum. When we show that we can't solve our own problems, then that does open up the door to competitor systems like the Chinese. And the model they offer looks so much more attractive than ours because the true costs of that model are hidden from most of the rest of the world.
Great. Thank you all. Let's open it up to some audience questions now. I'm not sure how this works. Should I just, whoever holds their hand up, okay, great. This young man. Yeah, you. I see you right there. Oh, is there a mic? My bad. Okay, so while the mic is coming, Nick, I just wanted to ask, is it kind of weird that we didn't talk about counterterrorism very much today? I mean, it was such a dominant topic, and if you could just answer this very quickly.
Yes, it is. And I think what it says is not that the terrorism problem has gone away, because it most certainly hasn't. We could have talked about it in the Syria context. We could certainly talk about it in the Afghanistan context. It just sits there alongside 10 other problems right now of equal magnitude.
Yeah.
And that's going to ultimately present a resource problem for the United States government, because making those resource choices among a much wider range of security challenges. When I was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, we pretty much had first claim on resource because we did terrorism stuff. Now I wouldn't expect my successor to have that claim on resources because there's so many other challenges the U.S. government faces.
Nick's former office, by the way, I used to call it the Death Star of Ops Center. It's totally rad. I mean, it's just the whole outlook is just amazing.
Can I engage in a little bit of personal privilege here and say that the National Counterterrorism Center, my last job in government, I served as director, exists because of Congressman Hamilton and the efforts of the 9/11 Commission. The vision of the 9/11 Commission pushed the Congress and the executive branch to reform the way government did business in the wake of 9/11. The job I held would not have existed without Hamilton and McCain and the 9/11 Commission. So.
Great. Okay, we have 23 minutes, so we're just going to take the questions and we're going to power through the answers as quickly as we can so we can get as many questions as possible. Sir.
Hi, my name is Kyle, and I'm a sophomore here at HLS studying international studies in Russian. And first of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming to speak today. But I'd like to direct my question to Mr. Rose. And I was hoping to know more about your opinions on the INF Treaty and also whether the Trump administration should try to extend the New START Treaty that's coming up for review.
Well, you know what we joke INF stood for in government, and it was my job to bring the Russians back into compliance. I failed miserably. It's never finished, and that's the kind of story with arms control. It's never finished. But to your question about INF, INF played a very important role in the late 1980s in helping resolve Cold War tensions. But by the late 90s, the Russians were raising questions about the treaty. Indeed, back in 2004, when I was a young staffer at the Pentagon, Sergei Ivanov, the Russian defense minister at the time, proposed a joint U.S.-Russian withdrawal from the treaty, arguing that the strategic situation in Eurasia had fundamentally changed since the end of the Cold War. In 1987, when the treaty was signed, you had two nations, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, who had the majority of the intermediate-range ballistic missiles. By the late 1990s, you had China, North Korea, Iran, India, Pakistan, who had these capabilities. So the Russians said, this strategically makes no sense. And you know what? I think the Russians were right on that. I mean, arms control is only effective when you ensure that it can meet the security conditions. Arms control is not an end in itself. It's about advancing American security. Now, the Russians had an opportunity through the treaty to leave the treaty under supreme national interest. Because, quite frankly, that's the same argument the United States made in the early 2000s with regards to the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. We said, when the ABM Treaty, as it was known, was signed in 1972, you only had a couple of nations with ballistic missiles. By the late 90s, early 2000s, you had 40 countries with ballistic missiles. But we exercised our legal right under the treaty to get out. The Russians did not do that. They cheated, they lied, and they continued to produce this treaty-limited cruise missiles. So, and they were not coming back into compliance. We, in both the Obama administration and the Trump administration, though I was not a member of the Trump administration, just for the record, tried to bring them back through diplomacy, but it didn't work. But the Russians were not coming back. Now, I actually have a good relationship with a number of people in the administration. They called me and they said, hey, Frank, what should we do with the INF Treaty? And I said, the Russians are not coming back into the INF Treaty. But if you get out, you need to do it in a way that places the blame on the Russians and keeps the allies together. Because INF was never really about arms control. It was about alliance unity. It was the Europeans, specifically the Germans, Helmut Schmidt, the German chancellor in the 70s, who called for the deployment to enhance extended deterrence. Now, they did not take my advice, and as a result, people were blaming the United States for killing the treaty, and the fact that the president announced the decision on the sidelines of a campaign rally in Nevada didn't help with alliance unity, but we ended up okay. New START. I strongly support extending New START. Not because I think it's going to get us to a world free of nuclear weapons, but for 3 reasons: deterrence, modernization, and alliance cohesion. As John Hyten, the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has said, New START is critical to enabling us to maintain an effective nuclear deterrent. Number 2, we are in the process of modernizing our nuclear forces. There was a deal done in 2010 that the United States would modernize its nuclear forces, and we would also have arms control. It's 2 halves of the same walnut. And then thirdly, arms control is very important in maintaining alliance cohesion for deterrence, especially as we have to respond to the Russian violation of the INF Treaty. Now, finally, let me just say this. I do think the Trump administration is right that we need to bring China into a future arms control framework, and we need to address new and emerging technologies like hypersonics, as well as anti-satellite weapons. But the way to do that is extend New START, gives you 5 years to work through some very, very tough issues. I don't know if these issues can be solved, but extending New START provides you time. And that, in many ways, is the most important thing.
Even if it was just extended by a year to year is what I'm hearing, that it just like to kind of test every year instead of doing another 10-year
you could do that, but let me just say.
But quickly.
Yeah, let me just say, my number 1 priority when I became Assistant Secretary was bringing China into an arms control regime. It is going to take time to make that happen. And there's a big question, and that question is, what is the United States prepared to give up and place limitations on its own capabilities in order to entice China to come in? They're not going to sign up to an arms control treaty out of the goodness of their hearts, or because President Trump sends a love letter. It's not going to happen.
But they come in such big envelopes.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. Actually, you, yes, you were the second person who raised their hand. Oh, okay.
Hello, I'm Alicia. I'm an international studies major, and my question is, so we're talking about Syria, Russia, China on national security, but for the longest time, the Trump administration perceived that there was an immediate threat at the border. And so I saw that there was a lack of that mention here, and I just want to know, is it because there's not really as a big perceived threat as the Trump administration has perceived, and we have seen resources go to that area as increased military money being pushed on making a bigger border. And so with that perceived threat, how is this deal of acts of violence committed here in the United States because of people perceiving this as a real threat against certain people, like we see in El Paso? So how are we dealing with the American, what I would call American terrorism against people in here? How can we be prepared as a country on the inside and deal with national security if we're not in the same alliance? We're all perceiving different threats from different peoples and minorities.
Wait, I want to clarify your question. Are you saying American terrorism as people who are not Americans who are committing terrorism, or people who are American who are committing terrorism against people who are not
So
American?
people here perceiving other people as a threat. So as we saw like in El Paso, very much minorities can also be American. And so perceiving different people as a threat, like the Trump administration focused on immigrants, specifically from Central America. So we saw somebody take that into their own hands. How can we be prepared? How are like the messages that the American people are perceiving? Like how can we be prepared internally for like these domestic issues? We mentioned terrorism on the inside, but I'm more worried about what's going to happen to me if I go out and someone perceives me as a threat, as we have seen in like
Let's talk about white supremacy as a national security threat as well.
Let me broaden back out. I think it's a terrific question because obviously President Trump came into office with an aggressive border security agenda. It was on the table in the campaign. He was looking to follow through on campaign promises. When he came into office, though, his administration sought to make an intelligence-supported security argument for much of what he was recommending or pursuing in policy. And to be honest, I was still serving in the administration during the first year of the Trump administration. And whether it was the travel ban or more aggressive enforcement at the southern border, there really was not a compelling security argument to make for those policy choices. There may have been other arguments to make. There may have been, I need to follow through on my campaign promises. There may be long-term economic arguments, but they weren't security arguments. And so the countries, for example, selected in the first travel ban, and there's a reason that travel ban continues to be litigated to this day, is because there's just no correlation that you can make, including looking at intelligence, the way I did for years and years, that actually ties those countries to a particular threat condition here in the United States. So clearly, the agenda of the administration was border security, but it wasn't intelligence-driven. And unfortunately, what that has led to is exactly what the question points to, and that is a false narrative that somehow we are under threat from people who come in from outside the country. When if you listen to the FBI director and when he testifies in front of Congress and talks about instances of terror and inside the United States, he's almost always talking about people who were born here, who grew up here, who were radicalized here, and who took upon themselves this horrific role of carrying out violence against fellow citizens, and it has nothing to do with where they were born or where they came from. And as a result, I think we're in this place where we're talking about the wrong things when we're talking about domestic terrorism.
If I could just add something briefly on that too. It's a great question. Obviously, immigration is a major concern for a number of Americans, and that's a legitimate concern. Different ways of applying policies for how you specify, what your immigration policy is, how do you enforce it. But to me, the greater danger, as Nick said, isn't the people coming across the border. Really, what I've seen is also the administration's response in which it's actually politicizing the military. So as Alicia mentioned, the military was mobilized by the president in the run-up to the midterm elections as part of his response to the security threat. This is part of a pattern that we've seen by the administration in using the military as almost a political tool, a way to highlight its stance on its toughness in global affairs, particularly in domestic affairs such as immigration. And we've seen a number of other initiatives, of course, the pardoning of troops who have committed war crimes or have been accused of committing war crimes. So this is part of a longer trend in which I think there's actually potentially a greater danger for the republic, certainly for the military itself, by breaking these norms about civil-military relations and not using the military as a particular political tool. And unfortunately, we continue to see the administration do this as it moves forward. So, but excellent question.
Kelly, you were shaking your head. Do you have a quick
Well, it's
addition?
interesting. I mean, so completely agree with what both Nick and Andrew have said. But, migration is going to be a challenge for the rest of the century. The migration patterns are enormous already. And if you look at the Americas, that's going to be a really key area where a new administration hopefully will focus some actual investment on the front end of these challenges, so you don't have mass migration moving towards, for example, the southern border. And that's investing in sort of the security and economic and political structures in Central America, and giving some of those countries the resources to deal with some of these challenges, addressing the violence issues in Central America that are driving a lot of the migrants north, addressing the economic issues. And it's true also for Europe. So, the migration out of the Middle East and North Africa into Europe and the southern states of Europe is also creating some of these challenges. And you're seeing the rise of racist, anti-immigrant policies and a lot of far right-wing European governments. So this is going to continue to be a challenge. And I think, to Nick's point, the fact that the Trump administration has clarified it as some sort of security threat when it really isn't a security threat, it's a number of issues. It's climate migration, it's economic migration, it's people fleeing actual violence. And so until we actually get at the root causes of some of those issues, we're going to be constantly on the back end of it.
Great. All right, let's try and squeeze in 2 more questions. We have 10 minutes, and yes, you. Yes, you.
Hi, my name is Caitlin Wishmeyer, and I'm a junior here at HLS. My question is a little bit more broad. So after World War II, the U.S.'s grand strategy arguably kind of centered around the access to oil and fossil fuels around the world. And I'm curious about how that changed and developed around how the U.S. looks and conducts national security now and in the future in response to being able to obtain oil and fossil fuels around the world.
I'll take that one.
Okay.
Jump ball.
Go.
Well, obviously, our domestic energy picture has shifted significantly in the last even 5 to 10 years. It really started in the Obama administration. Our own energy independence came through, and now we're an actual net exporter of energy to the world. And I do think it's causing us to reevaluate strategically some of our interests in places like the Middle East and the Gulf. And you see that driving the conversation, even in the political cycle, with respect to sort of ending the wars, changing our relationships with countries like Saudi Arabia and Gulf countries, and really pulling back and essentially saying, what are our actual interests in the Middle East, and do we actually need to be as invested from a military and security perspective as we currently are? I think that we're on the front end of that conversation, frankly. You have seen some folks write about the importance of really reevaluating our presence and engagement in the Middle East in particular. That said, I also think that energy flows are going to continue to be a geostrategic issue, especially as China, really has a high demand for energy. Japan still has a very high demand for energy. India, for example, and so the way that Belt and Road Initiative that the Chinese are driving is very much driven around geopolitical and energy issues, and the United States is going to constantly be engaged in that, and is going to have to think about those issues regardless of whether we're energy independent. It's global markets we're talking about here, for example. So I think it's going to continue to be, at the present, we're going to have to look at it differently. But I also think it should give us an opportunity to be creative about some of the way we have been approaching some of these issues in the past. In particular, I personally think we're overinvested in the Middle East, and so I welcome a chance to relook some of these relationships.
Okay, down in front. Maybe we can squeeze in one more after this.
I'm going to try and make this as brief as possible. So with issues, again, James Romano, studying international law and Chinese here at HLS. So with issues like space debris, anti-satellite missiles, and new private companies in space, do the panelists see space fundamentally as a place for collaborative peace or a potential flashpoint for conflict?
So I know Frank is dying to get to this one.
You just asked his favorite question.
Absolutely. I actually gave a speech in Maine a couple of weeks ago about this: space cooperation or conflict. But the bottom line is...
So if you've got 45 minutes...
Yeah, bottom line.
You might email him afterwards?
No, I see 3 big challenges to the space environment: orbital debris, the rise of mega satellite constellations like Starlink, which is going to put in 40,000 satellites over the next decade, and then anti-satellite weapons. Fundamentally, we're going to have to do both. We are going to have to work with the Chinese and the Russians to manage this orbital debris challenge. Actually, at the end of the Obama administration, we worked pretty closely with the Chinese to try to come up with a joint statement to say, doing debris-generating events like China did in 2007, which they shot down one of their own satellites, has 3,000 pieces of debris up there that will stay up there for 100 years is not a good thing. So we're going to have to work with the Chinese, the Russians, and others to maintain the long-term sustainability of the space environment and safety. On the other hand, the Russians and the Chinese understand how dependent we are for space, for our national security capabilities. It allows us to track, target, and destroy. And if they can deny us access to outer space, they will get advantage here on Earth during a conflict. So we're going to have to improve the resiliency of our outer space architecture. We're going to have to also improve the deterrence options. But we also need to have diplomacy. I would say, for the most part, I would give the Trump administration a B- for their efforts on space security. One, they're focusing public attention on the threat. Two, they're taking steps like reestablishing U.S. Space Command and the Space Force, though I'm not sure the Space Force is going to solve the problems we're seeking to solve. But one gaping hole is there's no diplomatic element to their strategy, and that's a big shame. I spent a lot of time on airplanes during the Obama administration having these space security dialogues with friends and partners, but also the Russians and Chinese. Those have really gone by the wayside in this administration. But, fundamentally, your question about space really gets to the heart of foreign policy over the next 50 years. And that is, how do we work with the authoritarian states like Russia and China on issues of shared concern, whether it be space, nonproliferation, pandemic diseases, climate change, at the same time pushing back on areas where we disagree? And that is going to be, I think, in many ways, the fundamental question in American foreign policy.
Great. I'm going to do what reporters do and push it to the deadline. So I'll take one more. Who's dying to ask a question? I'm going to give it to the guy who's standing on the side. Come on. No pressure.
My name is Evan Wright. I am a sophomore in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures here at HLS. My question is actually about alliances. So we talked about them a little bit, their importance for national security, but there are a lot of internal tensions that we're facing as well with our alliances. At least with Turkey, we have the issue of them buying Russian missile systems that aren't necessarily compatible with NATO equipment. And then we have US pressure on South Korea and Japan to contribute more to base costs. So essentially my question is the potential of sort of a weakening of these alliance systems a thing that we should consider a threat to our national security, or is this just a standard issue of alliance management?
Wait, what was the second part of it? Is it a threat to overall national security, or?
Yeah, should we consider this potential weakening of our alliances a threat to national security or just an issue in alliance management?
Okay.
I guess I'll start, but be very brief. I consider it a potential threat to our national security if we don't have that network of alliances around the world on which to rely for support in times of crisis. And the whole experience of the post-9/11 era has been one of shared threat, shared approach, shared even burden sharing with partners who see the problem the same way we do, who work the problem the same way we do, who in most cases, or in many cases, bring the same set of values and respect for rule of law traditions that we bring to the table. Not in every case. We've had to have some transactional relationships with partners who don't share our values, who don't work the way that we do. But by and large, this network of alliances is what allows us to be effective around the world, and we will be so much less effective around the world if we're acting on our own. And I could go on and on about this, but we're out of time. But this is probably the thing I worry the most about in terms of a continuation of the current foreign policy path we're on.
I think that's right. I would say I agree, but we tend to treat alliances like a fixed public good. And we need to stop doing that. They are living breathing organisms. And actually, burden sharing has been on the table in discussions for quite some time. Now, I think the administration is going about it the wrong way, and it's being not really great. But certainly, I think we need to be talking with our alliances about modernizing them, really looking at the issues that we want to focus on and tackle together, trying to network them better. So for example, networking our European allies more to our Asian allies with respect to dealing with a rising China. So I think, to Nick's point, this is our greatest strategic asset. We should be investing in them, but I think also at the same time, we shouldn't necessarily just treat them like they're just static.
If I could
So let's do Frank, and then you bring it home, Andrew.
No, I fundamentally agree with both of those points. What I would say, and I'll come back to the point that I made earlier, we are in a competition with Russia, China, and other authoritarian states. Our alliances are one of our asymmetric advantages in that competition, and we need to be bringing them closer to us. But at the same time, as Kelly said, we need to modernize those alliances. The alliance we had with NATO 50 years ago is not going to be effective given the new challenges we face in cyber, outer space, artificial intelligence. So these alliances are key, but they need to be adapted to deal with the emerging threats we're facing.
If I could just add a short personal experience as well. I mean, I think these points are all spot on. In my very short career with the Air Force as an active duty officer, about 4 years plus, I worked personally and closely with officers from Italy, the Netherlands, South Korea, Japan, Hungary, Germany, and probably maybe another dozen countries if I sat down and thought about it, and worked with them not only in sort of mundane tasks, but actually preparing for war, combat actions. The U.S. doesn't fight on its own anymore. We're just not able to do that. We can only be active and influential in the world with our allies, and it doesn't just happen from the get-go. It's not an abstract entity that you can just turn on and turn off. It's based on relationships of officers working together, military personnel, planning, training, getting used to working with one another, as I'm sure your husband is quite well aware. So this is something I think that maybe some of the lack of expertise in the current administration presents a challenge, so to speak, to how we're operating in the world. But hopefully, as we continue forward, we'll become better at that, managing those alliances and continuing to be exercising our influence in the world.
Keeping that challenge from becoming a threat. We have just now come back full circle. So thank you to all of you. We only busted deadline by 3 minutes, so that's pretty good. The paper will still go out tomorrow. And thanks to all of our amazing panelists. I've learned a lot. I will be calling each of you for stories. So be ready. Have a great day, everybody.